Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with a question that has preoccupied, well, mystics and philosophers for millennia,
A
really.
huge question.
A huge one. Can you find true, profound spiritual insight without adopting a single supernatural belief?
Ah,
Can you genuinely, wake up
okay.
without adhering to religion?
And that is the absolute core mission of Sam Harris's work, Waking Up, a guide to spirituality without religion. We are, I think, entering a space he explicitly designed for a modern audience,
Right.
specifically for that really significant demographic. The sources say it's about 20% of Americans who would call themselves spiritual but not religious
Yeah, you hear that phrase all the time.
all the time. And these are people who are, they're searching, they're looking for a vocabulary, a method for these profound subjective experiences, bliss, ecstasy, self-transcendence, but they needed to be grounded in reason.
And that search often leads people down paths that Harris finds, well, deeply problematic. The mission isn't just about finding well-being. It's about navigating this terrain that's just littered with what he calls pseudo-spirituality and pseudoscience.
Exactly. You can't just be a knee-jerk skeptic who dismisses it all as, nonsense.
But you also can't be a new age idealist who starts throwing around terms like quantum energy fields to explain things.
He demands an empirical path. And I think what gives Harris the authority to guide this kind of deep dive beyond his academic background is his decades of intensive first-person practice.
That's the key, isn't it?
It is. The sources highlight his extensive formal training. I mean, he spent 2 years on silent retreat,
2 years.
practicing meditation techniques for 12 to 18 hours a day. So he's not speaking from a position of theory. This is all from the lived experience of mental transformation.
That grounding is absolutely essential. It stops the whole conversation from becoming, purely academic. And the core argument we're going to unpack today is, for many people, pretty
It's
revolutionary.
a big one. That the quality of your life is determined moment to moment by the quality of your mind. And the greatest psychological obstacle, the thing stopping that quality from improving, is this profound, pervasive, and ultimately illusory feeling of having a separate, continuous self.
So let's start with the universal problem Harris identifies, which is just the inherent fragility of happiness. We chase after pleasures, right? A new job, a great meal, a vacation. But these states are, well, by definition, they're fleeting.
They have to be.
They demand constant effort, constant renewal, just to ward off boredom and, discomfort. Why do we settle for this exhausting cycle?
Well, because we've been conditioned to believe that desire and the gratification of that desire are the only sources of positive emotion. That's the only game in town.
Right.
And Harris sets this premise up perfectly with a famous and actually pretty self-deprecating personal story.
I love this story.
Yeah, when he was 16, he was in this 23-day solo wilderness program in Colorado. It all culminated in a 3-day solitary fast.
So this was supposed to be his big transcendent moment of contemplation.
Exactly. High mountain air, total solitude. This is it.
And what did the great philosopher-to-be discover during those days of absolute stillness?
He discovered profound misery, just abject misery. He says his only truly transcendent or contemplative thought during that entire 3 days was an overwhelming, torturous craving for a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake.
That's it. That's the big insight.
That's it. He calls it a state of perfect misery. And the realization just dawned on him that his unhappiness was entirely self-created. It was just being fueled by his own restless mind.
So that miserable experience, it actually becomes the foundation for the whole spiritual quest.
It does.
It establishes this logical, testable premise. If a source of deep well-being exists that isn't about gratifying desire, a way to be truly content, it has to be available even when all the material stuff, all the pleasure and distraction has been taken away.
Right. This is the essence of the cave experiment, or, the life of a dedicated monastic.
You remove all the content of the world, and if misery is still there, then the problem is internal. It's not external.
And this is precisely why he pivots so hard toward Eastern contemplative traditions, specifically, Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta practices, rather than Western monotheism.
Why them specifically?
He argues they function as empirical manuals. He calls them lab manuals and explorer's logs, detailing thousands of years of research on consciousness and suffering.
But, a lot of people hold their Western traditions sacred. His critique of the Abrahamic religions is pretty sharp.
It's very sharp. And it's because they fail the test of rationality and empirical observation. The Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they're all based on mutually incompatible truth claims.
They can't all be right.
They can't. They insist on the infallible truth of a specific revelation that inherently contradicts the revelations of the others. If Jesus is the sole path to salvation, then Muhammad's path is false, and vice versa. It forces this zero-sum game of belief, which is just the opposite of rational inquiry.
And he's blunt about it. He explicitly says that as manuals for understanding your own mind, the Bible and the Quran are, quote, worse than useless.
Strong language.
Very. He says any wisdom they might contain is just constantly subverted by contradictory dogmas involving ancient savagery and superstition.
It is uncompromising, but the empirical difference is so crucial to his argument.
Yeah.
Eastern teachings, especially those from Buddhism, they're not based on faith or some revealed truth. They are empirical instructions.
You X, you will experience Y.
Exactly. If you use this method of attention, you will notice why phenomenon about your own mind. They're fundamentally rooted in just understanding psychological suffering and the nature of the self. So if you strip away the cultural scaffolding, the reincarnation, the deities, you're left with a purely rational first-person methodology.
It sounds like he's trying to, I guess, strip away the magical thinking but keep the profound insights.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But he also insists that this separation is now leading to a necessary synthesis with modern thought, with science.
Absolutely. The source has really emphasized that these contemplative insights are confirming three key truths that science is only now beginning to validate.
Okay, what are they?
First, that the conventional unified sense of self is, in fact, an illusion. Second, that positive emotions, things like patience, gratitude, compassion, they're not fixed personality traits. They're teachable, trainable skills.
And the third.
And third, that the way we use and manage our thoughts directly and this is the key, physically influences our subjective experience.
And this whole convergence is really only possible because of advances in neuroimaging, right? What used to be purely subjective, like the feeling of bliss or your ego dissolving, is now something you can actually see in a lab.
Correct. We can now investigate these spiritual insights scientifically using fMRI and EEG. We can look at the long-lasting structural changes, the functional changes that different meditation techniques produce in the brain.
In areas associated with attention, emotion regulation, pain perception.
All of it. The mind is no longer a black box. Its transformation is becoming empirically verifiable, and that shifts spirituality from the domain of faith to the domain of science.
Okay, so let's move to the central target of Harris's entire project, because this is the concept that is, I think, the hardest for people to accept.
Without a doubt.
The conventional self, that I, inside your head, is a central delusion. What do we even mean when we say the self is an illusion?
We mean that feeling you have right now, you listening, that feeling that you are a continuous, unified entity, a little command post deep behind your eyes.
The thinker of the thoughts.
The thinker of thoughts, the experiencer of experience, the unchanging center. This feeling is incredibly compelling, but Harris argues it's, one, neurologically unsupported. It doesn't map onto any stable structure in the brain. And most importantly, it's the primary source of our psychological suffering.
How so?
Because it forces us to identify with every transient thought, every passing fear, every desire that floats through the mind. We take it all personally.
He gives us a really beautiful personal example of what it feels like when this illusion, just for a moment, drops away. His experience at the Sea of Galilee.
It's a fantastic description. It was a moment of spontaneous, profound stillness. He was just looking out over the hills, and suddenly, he says, the sense of being a separate self, an I or a me, vanished. He describes it as the feeling of peering out at the world from behind my eyes, just dissolving. Everything else was still there, the pilgrims, the sky, the water, but the observer felt no separation from the observed.
Only the world remained.
Unconditioned by an observing ego, yes.
That sounds, on one level, utterly terrifying, a total loss of identity. But he describes it as blissful stillness. How does that moment reveal the psychological trap we're usually caught in?
It reveals that the trap is our habitual identification with thought. We confuse the stream of thought, that inner narrator who's always chattering, with who we actually are.
Right.
Harris uses this really potent analogy here. Being lost in thought, he says, is basically the same as being asleep and dreaming.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when you're dreaming, you are entirely convinced of the reality of the dream's content, right?
Oh, yeah.
When you're lost in thinking about the past or worrying about the future, you are just as confused about who and what you are in that moment. You're living in a temporary self-created illusion. He even calls it a form of momentary psychosis.
Wow. So really dismantle this illusion. We have to go beyond just the subjective anecdotes and bring in the logical tools of philosophy. He uses thinkers like Derek Parfit to show why identity, as we intuitively feel it, just doesn't make logical sense.
Right. And Parfit's teleportation paradox is one of the most powerful thought experiments in modern philosophy, precisely because it just demolishes our gut feeling about identity.
So walk us through it.
Okay, imagine a machine. It scans you, atom for atom, on Earth, and it instantly recreates a perfect identical replica of you on Mars.
Okay.
The machine on Earth destroys the original you, but only after the Mars you is complete and fully functional.
So my first intuition is that this is basically just a really advanced form of travel. The person on Mars is me.
That's what everyone thinks. But Parfit forces you to consider the Earth you, standing in the machine just before disintegration. The Earth you realizes that the Mars you, even though they're identical in every single way, memory, personality, everything, it's not them. The Earth you is about to die.
So this act of travel is, for the original consciousness, just a terrifying, irreversible termination.
Exactly. The man on Mars is a replacement, a horrifying sham, as Eris puts it.
So the paradox is, if identity is what matters, then this kind of teleportation is basically murder.
Yes.
But if the original was destroyed before the copy was made, we might be tempted to say the copy is the original. It's the coexistence that proves they're two different people.
Precisely. Parfit concludes that identity, that single unbroken thread of self, is not what actually matters. What matters is psychological continuity, the memories, the beliefs, the mental traits that carry forward. But even that, he says, is divisible. If the machine made two identical copies on Mars, both would have an equal claim to being the original psychologically, but they would still be two distinct people. This logical impossibility lines up perfectly with the Buddhist concept of anatta, that there is no stable single self that's carried forward. Identity is a useful fiction, but it doesn't match reality.
And if that philosophical assault wasn't enough, the truly definitive proof that subjectivity isn't unified, it comes from neuroscience.
Right.
The split brain phenomenon.
This moves the argument from philosophy to hard, observable fact. The split brain is the result of a callosotomy, the surgical severing of the corpus callosum.
That's the huge bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres of the brain.
About 200 million nerve fibers,
Yeah.
It's typically done to treat severe, otherwise untreatable epilepsy. And Roger Sperry's research on these patients, it didn't just show that the hemispheres were specialized. It revealed two distinct centers of conscious experience operating inside one skull.
The specialization part is kind of easy to get your head around. Left brain does language and logic, right brain does spatial reasoning, facial recognition, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the separation of consciousness is truly mind-bending.
And we should detail the testing because it's crucial. A patient sits focusing on a central dot. Since our optic nerves are crossed, anything / briefly to the left, visual field, projects only to the nonverbal right hemisphere.
Okay.
Conversely, the right visual field projects to the verbal left hemisphere. So if we flash the word EGG on the left side,
Only the right hemisphere, the nonverbal one, sees it.
exactly. So the language-dominant left hemisphere, when you ask the patient what they saw, it responds, I saw nothing.
And it's being honest. The thinking, speaking self is genuinely naive to half of its own visual input.
Precisely. But here's the profound part. If the researcher then says, okay, reach behind this partition with your left hand and pick up the object you did not see, what happens?
The left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, which saw the egg.
So the left hand immediately and correctly picks up the egg.
Wow.
But then when the articulate left hemisphere is asked why the hand shows the egg, it doesn't say, oh, the other half of my brain must have seen it. It confabulates. It makes up a logical sounding story. It might say, oh, I picked the egg because I had eggs for breakfast this morning.
It creates a narrative to fill the gap in its own knowledge, all to maintain this illusion of a single, unified self.
That is the key takeaway. The speaking consciousness has this powerful, almost compulsive urge to tell a coherent story, even when it only knows half the facts.
And Harris really hammers this point home for its religious implication.
He does. If the mind can be literally sliced in two, how can we cling to the idea of an indivisible, immortal soul? He asks, if a split-brain patient's left hemisphere believes in Jesus and the right hemisphere is an atheist, does she have two immortal souls? One saved, one damned.
The neurological facts just directly contradict that foundational dogma of an indivisible essence.
They do.
And it also brings up another interesting observation. The sense of I seems to stay constant even when other parts of our personhood, like memory or body ownership, are totally distorted.
Yes, the difference between the self and personhood. So if you suffer from global retrograde amnesia, you lose all your personal memories, but that central I feeling persists. You know you are here, even if you don't know who you are.
And it's the same in an out-of-body experience. The self feels like it's displaced, watching from above.
Or the famous rubber hand illusion, which shows we can trick the brain into changing its sense of body ownership.
Right. So you have a fake rubber hand on a table, and your real hand is hidden.
And someone strokes both the fake hand and your real hand with identical brushes at the same time. After just a few minutes, the brain integrates the visual input, seeing the rubber hand stroked, with the sensory input, feeling the stroke.
And you start to feel the sensation on the fake hand.
You literally feel the brush on the fake hand. You experience it as your own. But the observing, perceiving self, the sense of I who is being fooled, that remains intact through the whole thing. It proves the self is separate from our physical sense of body. The self is just a feeling, and a remarkably resilient one, which is why it's so hard to shake just through philosophy.
So, okay, we've established the self is an illusion, both philosophically and neurologically. Now for the practical question. How do we actually dismantle it?
Right.
Harris first guides us toward the most widely accepted secular practice, what he calls the beginning of the road. Mindfulness, or vipassana.
Vipassana, which is often translated as insight meditation, is defined simply as clear, non-judgmental, and undistracted attention.
So you're just paying attention to the present moment.
Exactly. It's not about achieving a blank mind. That's a common misconception. It's about observing thoughts, sensations, and emotions as these transient objects without identifying with them. The goal is to wake up from that trance of discursive thinking, the ceaseless inner monologue, which he says is the real source of our suffering.
So it's not about thinking more clearly, it's about experiencing more clearly.
That's it.
You stop relating to your thoughts as these profound statements about reality, and you just start seeing them as mental events like, I don't know, weather passing in the sky.
Precisely. And this method is now being backed up by a really accumulating body of scientific literature. We're seeing actual structural changes in the brains of long-term meditators.
What kind of changes?
For example, they show increased density of gray matter and larger structures in areas critical for learning and memory, like the hippocampus, and even the corpus callosum itself, which suggests better integration between the hemispheres.
And there are also immediate functional benefits related to stress and emotion, right?
Yes. One of the most fascinating findings is that mindfulness training actually reduces the volume in the right basolateral amygdala.
The amygdala is the brain's alarm system for threat and fear.
It is. So a reduction in volume there correlates very strongly with decreased stress reactivity. Meditators aren't, eliminating emotion. They're changing their relationship to it. They just become less reactive to negative stimuli.
And that reduction in reactivity is perfectly illustrated by the studies on pain perception.
Indeed. When they're exposed to unpleasant stimuli, like a painful heat source, expert meditators report judging the intensity of the pain the same as novices.
So the physical signal is identical.
Identical. But they report finding the pain to be significantly less unpleasant. They interrupt that second stage of suffering, the mental aversion, the fear, the rumination about the pain. Mindfulness lets you experience intense sensation without clinging to the aversion, and that reduces the suffering.
But this kind of meditation, for a lot of people, it feels like work. It feels like this dualistic striving, right? There's this constant effort where I am the one trying to achieve some future state of enlightenment. Isn't that effort just reinforcing the very illusion of self that you're trying to overcome?
That is the central paradox Harris insists we have to confront. If you are striving for enlightenment as a future goal, then I am still the subject, the one working to get there.
We're trying to use the ego to dissolve the ego.
Which is counterproductive, right?
Yeah.
This dualistic approach, while it can be helpful for beginners, eventually hits a ceiling.
So how do we move past that subject-object divide? This is where he introduces the non-dual practices like Dzogchen and the methods of Ramana Maharshi.
The non-dual approach, particularly Dzogchen, or Trexad, which means cutting through, it aims for immediate realization. The goal is not to climb some mountain of preliminary practice. It's to realize, right now, in this present moment, that consciousness is intrinsically free of self.
It's an instantaneous recognition, not a gradual achievement.
Exactly. And Ramana Maharshi's famous method of self-inquiry is very similar. You focus your attention on the feeling of I, that subjective presence, and you just try to locate it. And when you look for it, it's absent from the field of consciousness. The observer cannot be found, yet awareness remains.
This sounds incredibly subtle. The difference between having a thought and realizing that consciousness is already thought-free must be razor thin.
It is.
Harris provides a fantastic anecdote about his time studying with students of Punjaji that illustrates this subtlety just perfectly.
Yes. Pujaji was a major exponent of Advaita Vedanta, who often insisted that realization of the selfless nature of consciousness was immediate, that it was already accomplished.
Which led to a kind of peculiar ethical environment.
It did, where he often felt obliged to acknowledge the full enlightenment of any student who claimed it. So Eris describes this apparently enlightened Swiss student who joined his group later to study Dzogchen with Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche in Nepal.
And this woman claimed she was enlightened, Red. She hadn't had any thoughts for over a week, felt her mind was just pure consciousness.
And Tulku Urgyen's response was a masterclass in contemplative instruction.
What did he say?
It was deceptively simple. Tulku Urgyen just said, "We're all going to wait for you to have your next thought."
Oh,
And within 30 seconds, her entire state just unraveled. She burst into frustrated tears and realized she had merely been thinking about how spacious and thought-free her experience had become.
she was lost in the thought of non-thought.
Exactly. Thinking about what is beyond thought is still fundamentally thinking. It proved that a subjective feeling of spaciousness is not the same as the non-dual realization of no self.
That moment perfectly illustrates the demand for just absolute empirical precision in this kind of work.
It does.
And that precision is also mirrored in Douglas Harding's unique Western articulation of non-dual awareness, the experience of headlessness.
Harding's instruction is simple and direct, but it often sounds bizarre at first. He described a moment where he just stopped thinking and realized that his shirt front terminated upwards in absolutely nothing whatsoever, certainly not a head.
What does that even mean?
He recognized that this physical space where the self should be was actually, quote, a vast emptiness, vastly filled, a nothing that found room for everything. He had lost the limiting concept of the observer, the head, and gained the world, which was utterly free of me, unstained by any observer.
So it's a direct empirical instruction. Look for the one who is looking and see if you can find them. Yet Harris notes that many cognitive scientists just completely fail to grasp this.
Yeah, they often mistake the instruction for denial or just, quirky philosophy. Harris specifically critiques thinkers like Douglas Hofstadter, who dismissed Harding's account as charmingly childish and solipsistic, viewing it as just a primitive denial of mortality.
He totally missed the point.
Completely. Hofstadter missed that Harding was offering a precise empirical technique for shifting perspective, a way to notice that the feeling of a self is just an ingredient in the experience, not the container of the experience. The eye isn't even required to observe the world.
So moving from the clarity of that kind of non-dual insight, we have to look at the surrounding spiritual ecosystem, which is often far murkier.
Very murky.
Harris spends a lot of time on the dangers inherent in the guru-devotee relationship and the ethical pitfalls of spiritual authority.
And this relationship is just fundamentally fraught. Its stated purpose is often to dismantle the ego of the devotee.
Right.
So if a guru is supposed to be perfectly enlightened, then any actions, even what looks like cruelty or a boundary violation, can be rationalized as crazy wisdom.
Or as compassionate instruction designed to expose and undermine the disciple's own egocentric illusions.
Exactly. And this structure encourages the devotee to suppress their own moral instincts, their own sense of self-preservation, and rationalize it all as, shedding attachment or fear.
The problem arises when the guru, having supposedly dissolved their own ego, starts to believe in their own inerrancy.
Harris calls this state like driving a car without brakes. When you believe you're beyond consequence, it inevitably leads to ethical failures.
Sexual exploitation, financial abuse.
A general lack of accountability.
Yeah. And the most profound critique here is that spiritual realization, even if it's genuine, it doesn't automatically erase cultural biases or flaws in ethical judgment. He highlights the story of his own teacher, Punjaji.
Yes, when Punjaji decided to marry off his niece, he placed an advertisement for a husband in a newspaper. Before it was published, he insisted on paying extra to have her skin color lightened by several shades in the photograph.
Wow.
And Harris points out this is just deeply entrenched cultural bias and bigotry toward darker skin. His conclusion was that either Punjaji was not fully enlightened, or enlightenment simply fails to eliminate these deeply ingrained cultural biases.
Hmm.
In either case, spiritual insight is decoupled from guaranteed moral perfection.
Okay, let's shift to another area that's frequently claimed as proof of consciousness existing independent of the body: near-death experiences, or NDEs.
Mhm.
Harris subjects these to some pretty intense skeptical scrutiny.
As he should. NDEs, they're characterized by the tunnels, the bright lights, meeting deceased relatives, a profound sense of peace. They are powerful subjective experiences.
No one denies that.
No one denies the experience, but they are consistently misinterpreted as evidence of an afterlife. Harris points out some significant scientific problems here. For one, NDE accounts very wildly across different cultures, which right away contradicts the idea of some universal spiritual domain.
And more critically, the vast majority of people who approach clinical death don't report having an experience at all.
That's right. And even when they do, there is almost always evidence of residual brain activity.
That's the key point. We generally can't establish that the experience happened while the brain was totally offline.
Exactly. And the most famous contemporary claim, neurosurgeon Ibn Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, hinged on this assertion that his visions occurred while his cortex was totally offline due to severe bacterial meningitis.
And Harris dedicates some serious time to just dismantling that claim. What is the fundamental physiological error in Alexander's account?
The error is a complete misunderstanding of cortical function during a coma. Alexander claimed his cortex was stunned to complete inactivity. But modern neurosurgery shows that even comatose patients retain substantial electrical activity, usually 50 to 70% of normal function.
So it wasn't offline at all.
Not even close. Furthermore, the brain doesn't just switch off instantly when oxygen drops. The brain is capable of incredible bursts of activity during the recovery period, which may have spanned hours or even days before Alexander regained full lucidity. That's a huge window for a complex vision to occur.
And the content of his visions, the brilliant orb, the angels, the butterflies, this corrugated multiverse, they're not scientifically unfamiliar, are they?
Not at all. They're virtually indistinguishable from descriptions of a DMT trip,
Dimethyltryptamine.
a very powerful psychedelic. It often produces visions that feel eternal, immensely profound, and involve transit through geometric spaces and communication with entities. Alexander rejected the idea that his experience was a drug trip, but the physiological truth is that experiences of that intensity only require a very brief span of biological time to unfold.
So his experience just proves.
It just proves how good a human mind can feel, whether it's triggered by a disease or a chemical. It doesn't prove the existence of heaven. Harris concludes that Alexander's work is a classic case of religious wish fulfillment and self-deception masquerading as science.
Okay, so if NDEs are unreliable, let's compare the two main reliable pathways Harris discusses for accessing these profound altered states. Meditation versus psychedelics. He's extensive personal experience with both.
He's very candid about this.
Mhm.
He talks about his indispensable use of psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, others in his early 20s. He views them as a uniquely potent means of altering consciousness. They guarantee that something significant will happen.
For someone who can't even conceptualize what ego dissolution means,
Psychedelics can provide immediate, awe-inspiring evidence that the conventional self is, in fact, dissolvable.
this opens the door to that famous metaphor of the brain as a reducing valve, which he borrows from Aldous Huxley.
Yes. The theory is that the brain's primary function might actually be eliminative. It acts as a reducing valve on what Huxley called mind at large, basically preventing the transpersonal, vast, or overwhelming dimensions of consciousness from flooding our awareness.
Which allows us to focus on the narrow scope required for, finding food and not getting eaten.
Exactly. And psychedelics temporarily loosen or open that valve.
But despite their power, he views them as highly unreliable for generating sustainable wisdom.
Highly. He says they are like strapping oneself to a rocket without a guidance system.
That's a great image.
It is. You might achieve profound, sublime, insight, boundless love, ego death, or, as Harris himself experienced, you can be hurled into states of mind so painful and confusing as to be indistinguishable from psychosis. A truly terrifying bad trip.
He described his worst trips as the most harrowing hours I have ever endured.
So the effects are haphazard, they're unpredictable, and they can sometimes lead to weeks or even months of psychological destabilization. They show you the destination, maybe, but they don't teach you how to fly there safely.
In contrast, meditation offers a safer, more sustainable path, even if it is much slower.
Meditation is likened to gently raising a sail. It's less haphazard, more stable, and crucially, the insights gained through discipline and training are integrated into the nervous system in a way that's stable and conducive to ethical behavior and long-term well-being.
So the freedom you're seeking through meditation is the ability to just stop clinging to the content of consciousness, to thoughts, moods, and desires.
Which is fundamentally freedom from the illusion of the self.
So we've journeyed from the miserable craving for a cheeseburger all the way to the splitting of the human mind and the promise of non-dual realization. What's the ultimate takeaway here? What is the final synthesis of Harris's secular spirituality?
I think the central liberating discovery is that the conventional feeling of I is a transitory appearance among transitory appearances, and it vanishes when looked for.
It's not a thing, it's a
It's
process.
a process that you can't even find when you look for it.
Hmm.
And so spiritual freedom and profound well-being, they're not future states you achieve through faith. They are immediate realizations you can have by training your attention and recognizing the pristine, selfless nature of consciousness as it is right now.
We can literally wake up from the persistent dream of being merely ourselves.
That's the promise.
And while Harris has rigorously debunked the idea of a soul separable from the body, and he's rejected all these supernatural claims, he does leave us with one mystery that remains genuinely irreducible.
He returns to the hard problem of consciousness. While we're certain that the mind is contingent upon the brain, that the soul isn't some invisible pilot inside the skull, the sheer, undeniable fact that this universe is illuminated by sentience remains perfectly mysterious.
We just have no idea how it works.
We have no idea, even in principle, how the emergence of subjective experience, the fact that it is like something to be you right now, springs into being from unconscious information processing, no matter how complex that process is.
That profound, undeniable mystery of existence itself, the irreducible fact of consciousness, that becomes the deepest, most secure foundation for the whole spiritual project.
It does. It urges us to notice what it is like to be aware in the present moment, free from the self that claims to be doing the noticing.
It's a mystery that requires no ancient dogma.
Only present attention.
If you'd like a shorter visual explanation of these ideas, check the description for the Mini Explainer companion video. And if you're watching the Mini Explainer first, you'll find a link back to this full deep dive for those who want a deeper exploration.